The ocean gave Ezio Vale everything, and then the night took it back. He surfaced through black water into a column of bioluminescence, and the world above was waiting for him. Horns, cameras, the Coast Guard spotlight swinging toward his face like a second sun. He had just descended deeper than any competitive freediver in recorded history and come back breathing. His name hit the air in a dozen languages before he'd even pulled off his mask. Ezio Vale. The record is broken. He floated on his back for a moment, staring up at a sky full of stars and noise, and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. That was the last peace he would know for a very long time. The cottage he'd rented on the Azores cliffside was small and sparse, the way he liked it. No clutter. Nothing that couldn't be left behind. Ezio had learned early that the best way to survive a life built on risk was to stay light, stay ready, stay alone. He showered the salt off his skin, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table while the adrenaline finished draining out of him. His dive watch read 2:47 in the morning. The live stream notifications were still flooding his phone. He turned it face down. The wind off the Atlantic pressed against the windows. Normal. The old wood of the cottage creaked under the weather. Normal. And then, not normal. A smell that did not belong to any ocean or any kitchen. Pine resin, iron, and something wild underneath it all, like an animal that had been running for a very long time. Ezio was on his feet before he consciously decided to stand. The shadow in the corner of the room was not a shadow. The man who stepped out of it was enormous. 6'4" at least, broad in a way that made the small cottage feel like a coat 2 sizes too small. He wore a long slate-gray coat over dark clothes, and his face, angular, sharp-boned, somewhere between 30 and ageless, carried the expression of a man who has already made every decision that needed to be made and is simply here now to follow through. His eyes were amber. Not brown catching the light. Amber that produced its own light, faint and terrible, burning in the dark of the room like 2 low coals. Ezio ran. He was fast, elite athlete fast, train body fast, the kind of fast that wins records and saves lives, and he covered the distance to the balcony door in under 2 seconds. It wasn't enough. The grip that caught him was not violent in any theatrical way. It was simply irresistible, the way gravity is irresistible, the way a current below the thermocline takes you sideways before you realize what's happening. One arm across his chest. One hand closing over his mouth. The man's body was radiating heat like a furnace, and his breath was steady, unhurried, as though none of this cost him anything at all. Ezio threw his elbow back. Twisted his head. Tried to get purchase on something, anything. The man absorbed it all without adjusting his grip by a single degree. Then the needle. A small, sharp point against the side of his throat, and after it, nothing. Not darkness exactly. More like the sensation of diving without a bottom, falling through water that has no floor, the light above getting smaller and smaller until it was just a pinpoint and then not even that. He woke to silk. That was the first thing. The sheets beneath his hands were silk, heavy and cool, and he grabbed at them without understanding why, like a man finding a handhold on a cliff. He was in a bed the size of a room. Above him, a vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow. Chandeliers hung dark. When his eyes adjusted, he began to understand the scale of what surrounded him. A chamber of volcanic stone, carved furniture built for a body larger than any he'd known, windows sealed behind iron filigree that looked 300 years old and entirely functional as bars. Beyond the iron, a forest that went on until it became the sky. He had no idea where in the world this was. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. He had no idea if anyone knew he was gone yet. The door opened. The man from the cottage came in, and in full light he was somehow worse, not uglier, not crueler, but more real. More solid. Like something that had always existed at the edge of the world and had simply stopped pretending otherwise. He'd changed from the gray coat into dark clothes that fit him like they'd been built for his body. His amber eyes moved over Ezio with an attention that felt clinical and possessive at the same time. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Let the silence work for a moment. Then, my name is Theron Ashvale. You are in the Carpathian stronghold of the Ashvale Pack. You are alive, unharmed, and you will remain that way. The pause. My pack's survival depends on what you are. And the moon decided what you are before either of us had a say in it. Ezio stared at him. His voice came out steadier than he expected. You have 30 seconds to explain what that means before I start breaking things. Theron almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Then I'll speak quickly, he said. The stronghold did not feel like a prison until Ezio tested every exit. By 7 in the morning he had catalogued the room completely, the windows sealed with iron bolts corroded into permanence, the balcony overlooking a sheer drop of 60 feet into old-growth forest, the main door locked from outside by something mechanical and quiet that his fingers couldn't solve from the inside. He'd checked the ceiling, which felt excessive, and then checked it anyway, because Ezio Vale had once spent 14 minutes at the bottom of the South Atlantic and come back up, and he'd learned that the exit you don't check is always the one that kills you. There was no exit. A woman arrived with breakfast. She was tall, silver-haired in the way of someone ageless rather than old, and she moved with the precise economy of a person who has been doing dangerous work for a very long time. She set the tray on the stone table by the window and said, without looking at him, "Eat." Her eyes, when they did find him, were the pale gray of a blade held flat. "Where am I?" Ezio said. "Safe." That's a description, not a location. She paused at the door. Her voice was careful. "You are safer here than you would be anywhere else right now. That isn't a comfort. It is a fact." She left before he could answer, and the door sealed behind her with that same quiet, immovable click. He did not eat. He paced instead, working through every variable he had. What he knew, he'd been taken from the Azores. Rendered unconscious for an unknown period. Transported, presumably by air, to somewhere with a Carpathian forest, which his geography placed broadly in Eastern Europe. The man, Theron Ashvale, had mentioned a pack. Had spoken of the moon as though it were an authority. Ezio had grown up in a scientific household and had believed, with confidence, in exactly the things that could be measured. He was revising that position. By midday, Theron came. He was different from the night before. The formality was still there, but lighter, like a coat worn without buttoning. Dark jeans, a plain black shirt that managed to look architectural on his frame. He noted the untouched food without comment, then met Ezio's eyes. "Walk with me," he said. No, that wasn't a question. The hallways of the stronghold were a different world from the locked bedroom. Vaulted stone corridors, paintings of landscapes and wolves and men who looked like they'd survived centuries through sheer refusal, chandeliers that scattered cold light across floors worn smooth by generations. Ezio walked 2 steps behind Theron at all times. He was memorizing the layout. The library stopped him. It occupied an entire tower floor, walls of leather-bound volumes climbing to a ceiling lost in shadow, a fireplace built for a great hall, long reading tables with oil lamps that looked as though they'd been burning since the 1800s. The smell was old paper and wood smoke and something underneath both that Ezio couldn't name, something almost living. "Every answer you think you want is in here," Theron said. "The prophecy. The history of this pack. What the blood convergence is and what it means." Ezio picked up a book from the nearest table. "Set it down. You brought me here against my will and now you're pointing me toward the reading material. I did what the situation required." "Your situation. Not mine." Theron's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again the careful composure had shifted slightly, like a stone moved an inch. "Do you think I wanted this? To take a man at the height of his life and chain him to a fate he didn't choose?" Ezio looked at him directly. "Then why didn't you ask?" The silence that followed was genuine. Not calculated. Theron had no prepared answer for that one, which told Ezio more than any answer would have. Before either of them could continue, a third voice arrived. The man in the doorway was older than Theron by a decade, broader in the shoulders, with a scar-running jaw to collarbone that looked like it had been made by something with more than 5 fingers. He had the particular stillness of someone who has been in enough real danger that ordinary tension no longer registers. His eyes moved to Ezio with the expression of a man assessing livestock. "The pack is asking questions," he said to Theron. "How long does the human stay alive before you decide which half of the prophecy he carries?" Theron's response was immediate. "Until I say otherwise, Calder." Calder inclined his head. But his gaze returned to Ezio one final time before he left, and what lived in it was not hatred exactly, it was something colder. The look of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at a number he can live with. The door closed. The fire crackled. Ezio looked at the man who had taken him from everything he knew, and tried to decide how much danger he was actually in. Not from Calder. Calder was legible. From the amber-eyed certainty of Theron Ashvale, who had made a terrible choice and was not apologizing for it and was, somehow, despite all of it, the most awake person Ezio had ever been in a room with. That was going to be the real problem. They came for him on the third morning before the sun was fully up. 2 pack members, silent, large, professionally unreadable, appeared at his door and indicated, without speaking, that he should follow. Ezio had spent the previous 48 hours testing the limits of what was and was not permitted in the stronghold. He'd been allowed the library, the inner corridor, one supervised walk in the outer yard where gray sky pressed down on stone walls and the forest watched from all sides. He had not been allowed near the gates. He had not been allowed near the kitchens, which he suspected had a delivery entrance. He followed the 2 wolves through the lower passages of the stronghold, noting every turn, and arrived at a chamber he had not known existed. It was underground. He felt the depth of it before he saw it. The way sound changed, the way the air thickened, the way his body registered descent the way it always did, with a small shift in his inner ear and a tightening behind his sternum. Stone stairs that curved in a long spiral. Then an iron door. Then a chamber that should not have existed beneath a house and clearly had for centuries. 7 elders sat in a ring of carved stone seats around a fire that burned from the floor itself. No pit, no vessel, just flame rising from the stone as though the earth here had always been burning. The walls were covered in a script Ezio couldn't read. The ceiling was low enough that Theron, standing at the center, had to angle his head slightly. He was already there. He turned when Ezio entered and something in his expression shifted, quickly composed, but shifted. Ezio filed that away. The proceeding was formal and pitiless. The eldest of the 7, a woman whose age was impossible to estimate, spoke in the old language first, then translated. The Ashvale pack faced the blood convergence in 26 days. The convergence would strengthen or shatter the pack's bond depending on what was brought into it. The prophecy named one human, marked by deep water, as the deciding factor. Hope or ruin. The question before the council was whether that human should remain alive long enough to find out which. Calder spoke for ending it now. His argument was not cruel, it was surgical. The probability calculation. The risk to hundreds of lives. The impossibility of loyalty from a man taken by force. Several elders nodded. Their eyes on Ezio were not malicious. They were the eyes of people who had made hard decisions before and were prepared to make another. Ezio stood very still and breathed the way he'd learned to breathe at depth. Slow, deliberate, using the minimum his body required. Theron spoke last. He stood at the center of the circle and did not raise his voice and did not perform conviction. He spoke with the flat certainty of a man reporting observable facts. The prophecy's ruin could not be triggered by killing the prophesied, it was triggered by the wrong choice at the convergence itself. Killing Ezio now would tell them nothing except that they had spent 4 centuries carrying a prophecy and then flinched at the end of it. He asked for 30 days. He asked the council to trust what they had always trusted. The vote was taken in silence. Stones dropped into the fire. 5 white stones. 2 black. The flame flared and settled. The human lives. On the condition that he trains, learns, earns his place. The convergence will be his test. Fail, and the vote reverses. 26 days. Ezio was escorted back through the spiral stairs and the stone corridors, and when the door of his room closed behind them both, because Theron had followed, which was itself information, he turned around. "You knew," Ezio said. "You knew they were going to do that, and you still walked me in there." "Yes. You let them sit there and debate killing me. I let them say what they needed to say so that I could answer it. If I'd suppressed the debate, they would have carried it underground, and underground is where it would have grown." Theron held his gaze. "I have run this pack for 17 years. I know the difference between a fire you put out and a fire you have to let burn until it has nothing left to take. And I was the kindling." Theron was quiet for a moment. "You were the argument I needed to win." Ezio looked at him for a long time. "That's a very cold way to think about a person." "Yes," Theron said. And this time the word had something in it that sounded, very slightly, like shame. He left without anything else, and Ezio sat on the edge of the silk-covered bed in a room that was not his in a country he wasn't sure of, with 26 days on a clock he hadn't set, and did the only thing that had ever made sense when everything else was out of his hands. He started planning. The pack trained before sunrise, and they did not adjust anything for him. Ezio had competed at an elite level for 11 years. He had trained in ice water and altitude and conditions designed to convince his body it was dying, and he had always come out the other side. He stood in the stone-walled outer yard on the first morning and assessed the wolves around him with the same methodical calm he brought to every dive. Read the environment, read the variables, find the line between what will kill you and what won't. Every wolf in the yard was faster than him. Every one was stronger. He understood this inside the first 2 minutes, and he accepted it the way he accepted that the ocean was larger than he was, as a fact to be worked with, not a judgment to be argued. Calder did not share this philosophy. He stepped forward to evaluate the human's worth personally, which was a polite way of describing what followed. The first blow landed before Ezio fully registered it was coming. A fist to the midsection that drove the air out of him and put him on the stone in under a second. Laughter moved through the watching wolves, low and contemptuous. Calder circled him with the relaxed attention of a man who has made his point and is deciding whether to make it again. Ezio got up. Calder hit him again. Harder this time. Ezio hit the ground, lay there for a moment, ran a quick internal inventory. Nothing broken, ribs protesting, jaw blooming with heat, and got up again. The laughter from the pack had changed quality slightly, the way a crowd changes when the result of something stops being certain. The third time Calder came at him, Ezio moved. Not well. Not with any grace. But his body had 11 years of reading momentum and finding the channel through it, and something in him caught the line of Calder's approach and bent around it. His elbow connected with Calder's ribs. Not hard enough to matter. Barely enough to register. But it landed, and Calder's expression changed from bored to attentive, and the yard went quiet. Training became the structure of Ezio's days. Mornings in the yard, where the bruises accumulated and the small adjustments added up. Afternoons in the library, where Vale brought him pack history and old texts and sat across the table watching him with her gray eyes as if she were reading something in him that he hadn't written yet. Evenings were quieter, the fire in the great hall, the sound of the forest, and increasingly, Theron. It was never announced. Theron would simply be in the library when Ezio arrived, working at the far table, not speaking. Or present at the edge of the training yard in the mornings, watching without commenting. A gravitational presence, steady and unignorable, like a current Ezio had learned to account for without thinking about it. One night, 3 weeks in, his body mapped with bruises and his reflexes beginning to move faster than his mind, Ezio collapsed against the yard wall after the others had gone. The moon was enormous, low and white above the treeline. He was staring at it when Theron crouched beside him with a flask of cold water and held it out. Ezio drank, handed it back without looking at him. "You're getting faster," Theron said. "I'm getting better at anticipating where Calder is going to hit me, which isn't the same thing. It's the beginning of the same thing." A silence. The water had tasted faintly of something mineral and clean. The heat of Ezio's body was just beginning to settle. He was aware, had been aware for days, in the way you're aware of a change in pressure before a storm, of how close Theron was sitting. How he had folded himself down to Ezio's level without any appearance of condescension. How his hands, resting on his knees, were perfectly still in the way of someone exercising care about what they do with them. "You're watching me," Ezio said. "Not the way they watch me in the yard. The other way." Theron didn't answer immediately. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause. Longer. Theron turned his head and his amber eyes caught the moonlight, and Ezio felt, with the particular precision of a man who has spent his life reading things that wanted to kill him, that whatever was living in Theron's expression right now was not dangerous in any way he'd been trained to survive. "I'm not sure I can answer that honestly yet," Theron said. "But I'm aware that I'm doing it." He touched Ezio's shoulder, steadying, brief, careful in a way that somehow made it more significant than anything careless would have been, and then stood and told him to rest, and walked back toward the stronghold without looking back. Ezio sat in the moonlight for a long time after that. The howl came at 2 in the morning, and it was not a call to gather. It was a summons to war. Ezio had been asleep for maybe 3 hours when it pulled him upright, not frightened exactly, but immediately, completely awake in the way of someone whose body has learned to treat unfamiliar sounds as data. He was at the window before the echo of it died. The forest below the stronghold was moving. Torchlight in the outer yard. Figures shifting through the dark. Voices raised in a language he'd spent 3 weeks learning to read by tone, and the tone tonight was fracture. Theron was in the corridor when Ezio opened his door. Already dressed. Face composed in the particular way of someone composing it deliberately. "Calder," Theron said. It was the entire explanation. The outer courtyard had the terrible stillness of a moment just before something breaks. Half the pack stood with Calder, who had placed himself at the center of the yard with the confidence of a man who had been planning this arrangement for weeks. The other half had gathered at the edges or around Theron as he entered, not strategically, but instinctively, the way smaller bodies orient toward mass. Ezio stood slightly behind Theron's right shoulder and tried to make himself a fixed point in his own thinking. Calder's argument was louder this time. No calculation, no council chambers. He spoke directly to the pack sphere, and he was good at it. How long would they allow their alpha to risk everything for a human who had no loyalty to them? The prophecy itself split between salvation and ruin. What kind of leadership gambled pack survival on the better half? The blood convergence was 18 days away. The logical choice was obvious. It had always been obvious. Wolves were listening. Some were moving. Theron stepped forward, and his presence alone stopped the momentum. A physical thing, the force of 17 years of absolute leadership pressing against the air of the yard. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He stated that Ezio was under his protection and that this was not a debate. Calder said, "You're damning us for him." Theron said nothing. And the silence was its own admission. The yard erupted. It was not organized violence. It was the chaos of a thing that had been building for weeks, finding its shape all at once. Wolves surged forward, Calder's contingent pressing toward Theron, loyal wolves pushing back. In the churning confusion, Ezio was grabbed from behind by someone he never saw clearly. A hand in his hair, an arm across his chest, a cold edge at his throat that he recognized by its specific geometry as a blade. Everything in the yard went still. Calder's voice, "Tell me he's worth it." Theron had turned. His amber eyes found Ezio's across the courtyard with an immediacy that said he had known exactly where Ezio was the entire time. the expression on his face stripped everything back. Not the alpha. Not the composed, deliberate man of the library and the training yard. Just a person realizing something at the worst possible moment. He moved across the yard slowly, hands at his sides, every wolf watching. He stopped at arm's length from Calder and looked only at Ezio. "Let him go," he said quietly. "Give me a reason," Calder said. "Because if you hurt him," Theron said, still quietly, almost carefully, "there will be no version of events in which you survive it. That is not a threat. That is the only honest thing I have said in this yard tonight." The blade pressed. A thin line of warmth traced Ezio's throat. And something ignited. He felt it the way he felt a current change at depth, sudden, total, radiating from his chest outward. Heat that was also light. Something that did not belong in a human body and was in his anyway, and it moved through him like a wave breaking, and he used it before he understood what he was using. His elbow drove back. He twisted against the grip with a speed that his own training did not account for. The blade scored skin rather than throat. He was free. Calder lunged. Theron intercepted him like a wall. What followed was not a fight to watch. It was a conclusion. Theron and Calder were two men who had been measuring each other for decades, and the measurement had always ended the same way, and it ended the same way now. Calder on the ground, Theron standing over him, the pack utterly still and silent. But Ezio was the one bleeding, slumped against the courtyard stone with his hand at his throat, and his knuckles were glowing. Pale silver light, faint but visible, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Every wolf in the yard was staring. Vale pushed through from the back of the crowd, her gray eyes moving from his hands to his face to Theron's. She looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, like she had not accounted for a variable. Theron reached him and knelt without ceremony, one hand cupping his jaw, tilting his face toward the torchlight to assess the cut on his throat. His thumb rested against Ezio's cheekbone. He was close enough that Ezio could feel the warmth of him, the contained, furnace-like heat that had frightened him on the first night and had become, over weeks, something he simply registered as Theron. "What is happening to me?" Ezio said. Theron's voice was very quiet, and something in it was coming apart at the seams. "I think the moon has been trying to tell me something for weeks. And I have been afraid of what it means." 18 days. The pack fractured. And between them, something that had run out of room to stay unnamed. Vale examined his hands the next morning with the concentration of a person reading a text in a language they had studied but never spoken aloud. The silver light had faded by dawn, but she could still feel something, she said, a residue, like heat left in stone after the fire goes out. She had a word for it. Pack fire. The old covenant magic that ran in the Ashvale bloodline and, occasionally, in the very rare human brought into deep enough proximity with it. Not a half-blood. Not a bite. Something stranger. A human body that had been absorbing pack fire through weeks of close contact, under high stress, the way certain materials absorb and hold heat. The blood convergence would be the test. It would either complete the bond or burn through him. There was no middle outcome. Ezio sat with this information for a while after she left. Then he went to the cliffside balcony of his rooms and stood in the cold morning air and watched the forest breathe. He could see the training yard from here. Theron was already in it, moving through a form alone, precise and economical and completely present in his body the way Ezio had noticed from the first week. Not performance, not display, just a person entirely at home in what they were. The pack moved around him in their own routines, the orbit unconscious, the gravity real. Ezio had found the exit route 11 days ago. A lower passage off the wine cellar, a section of iron grating that had corroded enough at one hinge to move if you were patient with it, and a descent into the forest that was manageable if you knew how to fall correctly, which he did. He had stood in that passage twice in the small hours of the night and felt the open air on the other side of the grating and thought about the Azores and his apartment and the clean simplicity of a life built only around depth and breadth and the ocean's indifferent dark. He had gone back to bed both times. He had told himself it was strategy. It was not strategy. He found Theron in the library that evening, standing at the fireplace with his back to the door and both hands on the mantel, the posture of a man holding himself together with architecture. Ezio came in and closed the door. "Tell me all of it," Ezio said. "The version with no omissions." Theron turned, and for once did not compose himself before doing it. He looked, simply, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He told the full truth. The prophecy's mechanic. A human brought to the pack by fear would bring ruin. A human brought by genuine bond, by something freely given, would anchor them through the convergence. He had known this since he was 20 years old. He had kidnapped Ezio anyway, because the timeline was closing and his options were narrowing, and he had told himself that the bond could be built once Ezio was here, that the how of it wouldn't count against them. He had known, even as he made the decision, that this logic was a lie he needed badly enough to believe. "You should have asked me," Ezio said. "Yes. You should have come to me, told me the truth and asked." "Yes." Theron's voice did not make excuses. "I would have, if I'd had more time, or more courage, or less fear. I told myself they were the same shortage. They weren't. So the whole foundation of this is wrong. The prophecy says freely given, and you started with a needle and a locked room." "Yes." Ezio looked at him. "And you're telling me this now, which means you've calculated that telling me does less damage than not telling me, which means you're still—" "No." Theron cut across him quietly. "I'm telling you because you asked me for the truth and I'm done giving you anything else." The pause. "Whatever it costs." The fire crackled. Outside, a wolf called from somewhere deep in the forest. Ezio stood in the middle of the library and understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes only at depth, that he had two choices: treat this as what it looked like, a man who had wronged him badly and was now being honest about it, or treat it as what it actually was, which was all of that, and also Theron, who had sat beside him in a moonlit yard and said, "I'm aware that I'm doing it," and who had moved across a fractured courtyard with his hands at his sides and told Calder in the quietest voice that there was no version of events. Both things were true. They had to be held together. "If I had said yes," Ezio said, "if you'd come to me on the Azores and told me everything and asked, would you actually have believed it? That I could freely choose this?" Theron was quiet for a long time. "No," he said. "I think I believed, at some level, that no one who understood what they were choosing would choose it. And now?" Theron looked at him with eyes that had stopped being an alpha's eyes. "Now I understand that I was wrong about that. And it may have cost us the only thing that could have saved them." Ezio crossed the library. He stopped in front of Theron and looked up at him and said, "Or it may have gotten us here. To this exact moment, where both of us know exactly what the situation is, with 17 days left, and I am telling you that I have known the exit route for 11 days and I have not used it." Something moved through Theron's face. It passed quickly and left something steadier in its place. His hand came up and touched Ezio's jaw, not the clinical assessment from the courtyard, something different. Something that asked a question without words. Ezio answered it. What happened next was not soft or simple. It was 2 weeks of held breath and real fury, and something too large for either of them finally breaking the surface. When they separated, both of them were unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Theron pressed his forehead to Ezio's. His voice was wrecked at the edges. "If the prophecy names you ruin. If I am standing at the end of all of this and the moon demands it." "You'd refuse," Ezio said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you told Calder there was no version of events. And you meant it then, before any of this." Ezio pulled back enough to see his face. "Stop performing the tragedy, Theron. We have 17 days and something worth fighting for. That's more than most people get." Theron looked at him for a long moment. And then, quietly and entirely without warning, he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, transforming his face into something younger and undone and completely different from anything Ezio had seen in 7 weeks. Ezio filed it away. He intended to see it again. The moon rose red. Not the dull orange of atmosphere and angle that Ezio had seen over the ocean. Deep, arterial, the color of something vital and exterior. It cleared the tree line at 11:47 and the entire forest changed under it. The shadows shifted, the temperature dropped without wind, and every wolf in the Ashvale stronghold stopped what they were doing and looked up with the same expression. Recognition, old and involuntary, like a word remembered in a language you thought you'd forgotten. They gathered in the outer yard without being called. Ezio stood at the center with Theron to his left and the ring of packs surrounding them, and the courtyard torches burned strangely in the blood moon's light, their flames flattened and red-tinged as though the air itself had changed composition. The stone walls radiated a cold that went deeper than temperature. This was not weather. This was something older than the stronghold, older than the pack, older than the prophecy that had carried Ezio here by force and kept him by choice. Calder was in the ring. Subdued, his contingent reduced to the small number who had stayed loyal even after the courtyard. His eyes on Ezio were the last of something. A final investment in a position that was running out of ground to stand on. The eldest elder stepped forward. Her voice needed no help from acoustics. The convergence is upon us. The moon asks its question. Alpha, does the human stand with this pack or against it? Theron did not look at the elder. He looked at Ezio, and Ezio looked back, and what passed between them in that moment was not romantic or dramatic. It was simply two people who knew exactly where they stood. He stands with us, Theron said, because he chose to. Calder moved from the ring. His voice was everything he had left. He was taken. There is no choice in a locked room. You have confused your own obsession with fate, and you have brought a stranger into our blood and called it salvation. He turned to face the pack directly. Kill the human. Break the false bond. Let the convergence find us as we are. Some wolves shifted. The doubt was old and it lived in their bodies. And then Ezio spoke. He'd been a competitive athlete for 11 years. He knew the difference between a crowd that was with you and a crowd deciding whether to be, and he knew that volume was not the tool for the second kind. He stood in the center of the ring and let the silence work before he used it. He's right that I was taken, he said. I was, and I was furious, and for weeks the only thing keeping me here was the locked door. The pause. Every wolf in the ring was still. I've known the way out for 11 days. The lower passage, the corroded grating, the descent into the western forest. I could have been gone 17 times over. The silence that followed was total. I'm still here. He looked at Calder, not with anger but with the steady attention of a man who has done his arithmetic. Not for the prophecy. Not because I was convinced or coerced or ran out of options. Because the man who took me also told me the truth when he didn't have to, and trained beside me, and stood between me and a blade without calculating the cost first. I'm not his prisoner. I stopped being his prisoner a long time ago. He looked at the pack, all of them, the loyal and the doubtful, the wolves who had hit him and the ones who had, gradually, stopped laughing when he got back up. I understand your fear. I would be afraid too. But you're being asked to destroy the thing that might save you because you can't believe it would choose to be here. I am choosing to be here. That's the answer the prophecy needed. Not force. Choice. The blood convergence reached its peak. The red light intensified and the silver fire in Ezio's chest, which had been present since the courtyard, which Vale had named and he had learned to feel, ignited completely. It rose through him in a column of cold light, steady and bright, visible to every eye in the ring. Not violent. Not burning. The way bioluminescence looked in deep water, lit from within, alive, ancient, patient. The pack dropped to its knees. Not in fear. In the way you bow to something that was always going to come and has finally arrived. Calder stood for 3 seconds longer than everyone else. Then his knees hit the stone. The eldest elder's voice was barely sound. The covenant accepts him. The moon has answered. Theron moved across the yard and the silver light moved between them as he came, his amber fire and Ezio's silver meeting at the point of contact, braiding into something that had no name because the pack had not seen it in 400 years. Theron's hands found Ezio's face, and the light ran along the lines of contact like current finding its path, and the blood convergence held the moment as though it had been building toward exactly this for as long as it had been building toward anything. The red moon began to clear. The arterial color bled out of the sky, and what replaced it was ordinary white moonlight, quiet and familiar, and the courtyard breathed again. Calder, still kneeling, said nothing. He had nothing left to say. Theron turned to face his pack. He was still bleeding from the week-old injuries that hadn't fully healed, and he stood like it didn't matter, because it didn't, because the thing that had been threatening to break had not broken. "He stays," Theron said. "Anyone who cannot live with that. The gates are open." No one moved. Later, when the stronghold had settled into the particular quiet of something resolved, they sat together on the cliffside balcony with the forest below them dark and breathing. The sea was somewhere beyond the treeline, too far to see but close enough to smell if the wind was right. Ezio could smell it tonight. "You knew the exit," Theron said. 11 days. And you said nothing." "I was busy." Theron was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you go?" Ezio looked at the forest. Looked at the moon, ordinary now, indifferent and clean. Thought about the Azores and the record and the way the bioluminescence had looked coming back up, the light getting larger instead of smaller, the surface rushing toward him, the knowledge in his whole body that he had gone as deep as a person could go and the world above was still there, still waiting. "I've spent my entire career going to the bottom of the dark," he said. "The whole skill of it, the thing that separates the ones who survive from the ones who don't, is knowing what's worth coming back up for." He paused. "I found something worth staying down for instead." "That's new." Theron's hand found his in the dark without looking. His grip was warm and certain, the way everything about him was certain, and Ezio held it and felt the packfire move between their palms like a tide. The prophecy was fulfilled. Not in blood. Not in the way the pack had feared it for generations. In the oldest possible way, one person turning to another in the dark, with every reason to leave, and deciding to stay. That was hope. That was always what hope had been.